Hey guys, Jason here with probably the last iteration of the decks that didn't make it. As you probably know, we put a lot of thought into the decks that comprise the lineup of every season of TCG decks and duels, and naturally, not every idea can materialize into a deck that lives on in the Gauntlet canon forever. So the purpose of this video is to have some fun letting you guys in on what we had planned, and hopefully some of what I'm about to share might come in handy in case anyone is thinking of building a similar deck. So, jumping in, the first deck I want to cover is Courtney Alexia. This is an aggressive deck that combines Courtney Summerbreeze Fairy, which makes every card in your mana zone every civ, with Elixia Pureblade Elemental, which powers up for each civ in your mana zone. So where the idea came from? Well, Elixia Brute Force Elemental is of course a card many DMP players who played in the early days will be familiar with, and a watered down version just seems like a fun pairing for Courtney. Now how it works? Well, it started out as a Nature Light deck, but it didn't run very well, so we moved it into a Water Nature Light aggro core, which is very much a proven concept. So the aim is to chug along, build advantage in the early stages of the game, and then get Elixia plus Courtney out ASAP. And the deck runs Rumbling Terrahorn and Soul Swap to search out the combo pieces. Now why did we not pursue this deck? Really, the combo is pretty fragile since Courtney is easy to remove and Elixia is slow and lacks protection, but more so than anything, the combo just doesn't do enough. I thought summoning a vanilla triple breaker as early as turn 5 would have more upside than it did. Elixia in DMP is much better because the win is set up as 4+1+win, so 3 attacks, which turns out to be much better than the 3+1+1 plus Todomida, which is 4 attacks under this current structure. I think you could maybe experiment with running a 4-civ build plus Petrova to give yourself another way to make Elixia live without Courtney, but I still don't think the concept is very good. On the subject of Courtney, our next deck is Diamondia. So this is a tribal snow fairy aggro deck, simple as that. Where this idea came from? Unsurprisingly, we took inspiration from DMP for this one. If you've been following DMP since the beginning, you will remember the extremely buffed version of Diamondia wreaking havoc on the format. This is built in the same vein as those Diamondia decks of old, but it is of course nowhere near as good. I thought it was worth a shot though, since DM13 did give some decent snow fairies, and I love my cheap medium-sized evolutions. How it works? Well, the aim of the deck is to power up snow fairies with Petrova and beat down the opponent. Any snow fairies that die can be retrieved with Diamondia. Unlike in DMP, the deck runs ramp and non-snow fairy nature mana fodder, because Diamondia's effect to grab from mana is compulsory. So if we end up having too many snow fairies in mana, it might end up biting us later in the game. Why did we not pursue this? Well, this was mostly a victim of time constraints. We just didn't have enough time to really explore and fine-tune the concept. And if I'm being honest, we also weren't entirely sold on how good Diamondia could be in the TCG. Add these to the fact that we already had plenty of aggro decks for Season 3, well, that's just the nail in the coffin. Though I will say, if we were to make one deck from this video, and it were entirely up to me, it would probably be this one. The next deck I'm covering is Fire Dark Rush. First and foremost, this is a Rush deck, but it is also a meme deck. I came up with this list in like 5 minutes, and because of the nature of the cards, we called it the Junk Deck, which is a name Andrew really likes. Where this idea came from? About halfway through the production of Season 2, we had scrapped a couple of decks, and I was trying to come up with new ones, so I threw this together. Essentially, between Fire Light Rush and Fire Nature Rush being established concepts, and Fire Water Rush having been on our radar since Season 1, I figured the last combo to try would be Fire Dark Rush. How it works? It's fashioned in more or less the same way as Fire Light and Fire Nature Rush, but the cards it has access to unfortunately aren't as good. It works like every other TCG Rush deck, and in hindsight, I realized that might not have been the best approach. The reason we ultimately didn't pursue this deck was because, well, it just wasn't very good. It was kind of high roll-y by nature, but it also wasn't that hard to stop, and the upside wasn't tremendous, which kind of defeats the purpose of the high roll concept. If I were to take a stab at it again, I would try to reinvent the formula. Given the TCG card pool, I don't think there's anything that this Fire Dark Rush build offers that Fire Nature and Fire Light Rush don't. So I would instead test some funky cards like Hourglass Mutant, Gachak, Snake Attack, and maybe even Giga Rays to give it points of differentiation or situational advantages. On the subject of throwaway Rush decks, I also whipped together a list for Mono Fire Rush. It's also kind of a meme, and it's very similar to Fire Dark Rush. After I put together the Fire Dark Rush list, I realized that the deck was actually carried by its Fire section. Fire has a lot of interesting and playable 2-drops, and these would often have to compete with each other in other Fire Rush builds. So I thought there may be enough meat on the bone for a Mono Fire Rush deck. How it works? Again, it's built in the same way as your typical TCG Rush deck, but lacks the additional dimensions other civs bring to the table. As we saw with Fire Water, aka Bounce Rush, not having an extra 1-drop attacker is really unfortunate for a Rush deck. So that kind of answers the question on why we didn't pursue it. I will say that I feel like there's a chance this deck was actually better than the Fire Dark Rush list I just showed, but it's probably not by much. And again, it's just too similar to Fire Nature and Fire Light Rush, and we just weren't fond of this deck. If there's a consolation prize in all this, it's that if you're a fan of mono-civ decks, there is at least a somewhat serviceable concept for mono fire. On the subject of Dragonoids, for the last of the Rush-ish decks, we have the old Akashic deck. If you remember the Bounce Rush deck profile, I talked about how that deck was originally supposed to be a deck centering around Akashic first. The idea of this deck came from Damien. He just liked the card Akashic First Electro Dragon when he looked at the DM13 set list, and with it being a boss card and a foil, we thought it would be pretty cool to build around. As for how it works, we tried a couple of different builds for this, but I think the one I'm showing here captures the original spirit of the concept the best. In order to take advantage of sympathy, we thought some sort of tribal aspect was necessary. So the deck tries to be mid-range, in that it is built to be aggressive to rush down the slower decks, and it runs a few control-ish cards like Searing Wave and hopefully a sympathy-reduced Akashic to contain faster decks. While I no longer have a list for it, I should also mention that we briefly tried a more control-centric list with Darkness. It deviated from the tribal theme and tried to combo Akashic with Slash and Burn. Ultimately, we abandoned both Akashic concepts because they just weren't very good. In the case of the mid-range style list you see here, we felt that the deck was unable to do enough, nor could it do a single thing particularly well. And in the case of the more control-heavy list, it was just really clunky and didn't do anything better than the more generic control decks. This was one of the concepts we tested early, so we actually spent quite a lot of time on it. And while it saddens me that Akashic, who should totally have Double Breaker by the way, never made it into Season 3, I'm glad we at least got Bounce Rush out of the later Akashic skeletons, so it wasn't all for nothing. Our final list for this video is Galamuta Pliers. This would have been an update on the Mikey's Pliers deck from Season 2. Galamuta is, in my opinion, one of the more iconic cards from DM13, even if he wasn't particularly impactful at the time of his release, and I am still a little sad he didn't make it into Season 3. The fact is, when compared to the other TCG era cards that dodge shield triggers, he's lacking, though I would love to be proven wrong on this. I don't know where exactly we got the idea from. I'm not sure if this was ever a competitive archetype in DMP, but I have seen a DMP list or two that covers this concept, so maybe it was a rogue deck at some point. But back in Season 2, Andrew toyed with the idea of pairing Cryptic Totem with the Pliers, since Cryptic's slowness was always what held it back, and I figured Galamuta could play a similar role while being a tad bit faster. How it works? The deck would have functioned in a similar manner to the Mikey's Pliers deck of old, in that it'd try to piece something together until Mikey's Pliers could set up for a big play. Cryptic, of course, didn't make it into the current Mikey's Pliers deck, but I think the advantage Galamuta could have over it was that it could come out earlier, since you can play a Beastfolk on 2 or 3, Pliers on 4, and Galamuta on 5, and swing with everyone. And there's some shenanigans later into the game you could do with summoning a bunch of Beastfolk and Galamuta for cheap. Why did we not pursue it? Ultimately, we didn't think this would still be that good. I also didn't want Pliers to be the meme deck for 2 seasons in a row, and we also had a lot of time constraints, so we never bothered exploring the concept further. Sorry about that. And on that note, we have reached the end of the video. Season 3, epilogue and all, done and dusted. You know, I have to say that I actually quite enjoy these sorts of videos because they allow me to cover decks without feeling the need to go into too much detail. Now, like in the last Rejects video, I'd love to know if there's a deck you're particularly bummed about us dropping, or maybe you think the current Season 3 lineup is for the best. Let me know in the comments, I'd be curious to know. Anyway, we appreciate you all tuning in and joining us on the TCG extended journey. It was a heck of a lot of work, but I'm glad we did it. But that's all for now, so as usual, thanks for watching, stay safe, and we'll see you guys next time.